Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy and specifically to talk about a problem that's becoming increasingly difficult for the Kremlin to contain. For the first 4 years of the war in Ukraine, most Russians were shielded from its direct consequences. The fighting was taking place elsewhere. The missiles were landing in somebody else's country. The destruction was happening thousands of miles away. For many ordinary Russians, life continued as normal. People came and went to work. Children went to school, businesses carried on trading, cars were filled up with gasoline at the filling stations, and although the war dominated the headlines, for millions of Russians it remained something that was happening somewhere else. However, over recent months the situation has started to change. As Ukraine's drone campaign has expanded, attacks on Russian oil refineries, fuel depots, storage facilities, pipelines and transport infrastructure have become more frequent, more sophisticated and more damaging. And the consequences are now starting to be felt inside Russia itself. Recent reports state that Russia's crude oil production has fallen to its lowest level in 12 months. At the same time, as a direct result of ongoing Ukrainian attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, multiple regions are now experiencing fuel shortages, supply disruptions, and growing concerns over fuel availability. Drivers are facing queues to fill up their vehicles. Gasoline stations are temporarily running dry, regional officials are being forced to intervene, and Moscow is now dealing with a challenge that extends far beyond the battlefield. Because when people struggle to buy fuel, when farmers can't obtain enough diesel, when businesses face supply disruptions and transport costs begin to rise, the war is no longer something happening somewhere else. It's arrived on Russian people's doorsteps. Now, before we go on any further, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that red subscribe button and also give me a thumbs up for this video. It really does help me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. Now let's get into the details. According to the latest data, Russian crude oil production fell to around 9 million barrels per day in May. That's the lowest level that's been seen in the last 12 months. Now you may be thinking, well, 9 million barrels per day, that sounds like a pretty big number, and it is. Russia remains one of the largest oil producers in the world. However, the figure that really caught my attention was not the 9 million barrels being produced, it was the comparison against the target level required by Russia. According to Bloomberg, Russia's energy system requires 9.7 million barrels of oil to be produced every single day. In other words, production is running around 700,000 barrels per day below the level that's considered necessary. Now that is not a small shortfall. 700,000 barrels per day is equivalent to more than 250 million barrels per year. That is an enormous gap. More importantly, it suggests that the impact of the attacks is now becoming measurable in the production data itself. For much of the time that Russia has been invading Ukraine, Russia's energy sector has proved remarkably resilient. Despite the sanctions and the export restrictions and the withdrawal of many Western companies and hundreds of billions of dollars of economic pressure, oil production has remained relatively stable. But what appears to be happening now is that the repeated attacks on infrastructure are beginning to create cumulative damage. Each individual strike may be manageable from the local facilities perspective, but when dozens of facilities are targeted over a period of months, the disruption begins to add up. And that brings us to the second problem that Russia is facing. Because producing crude oil is one thing, but turning that crude oil, which is the raw material, into usable fuel is something entirely different. Russia's refineries are becoming increasingly important in this story. Ukraine has repeatedly targeted refining facilities all across Russia. Facilities around Ryazan, Tuapse and Volgograd and several other locations have all faced attacks over the past 18 months. Not every strike results in significant damage, but the objective is not necessarily destruction, it's actually disruption. A damaged processing unit can reduce output. A fire can force temporary shutdowns. Repairs can take weeks or even months. Maintenance schedules become much more complicated, and gradually the entire system becomes less efficient. That's why fuel shortages can emerge even when a country continues producing millions of barrels of crude oil every day. The problem is no longer simply extracting the crude oil. The problem is refining it, transporting it and delivering it to where it's needed. And nowhere illustrates that better than Crimea. Recent reports have described long queues at petrol stations, temporary shortages, and rationing measures in parts of the peninsula. Local authorities have attempted to reassure residents, but the reality is that supplies have been clearly disrupted. For the Kremlin, this is particularly sensitive. Crimea has enormous symbolic importance. It's been presented for years as one of Russia's greatest strategic achievements. Yet today, fuel shortages are becoming one of the most visible consequences of the war in Ukraine. The challenge is largely logistical. Ukraine has increasingly targeted supply routes, transport hubs, storage facilities, and infrastructure linking Crimea to mainland Russia. A country can have fuel available elsewhere, but if moving that fuel becomes more difficult, shortages can still appear in local markets. And this is where Ukraine's strategy becomes increasingly interesting. The goal is not necessarily to destroy every refinery. The goal is to create friction throughout the system, stretch Russian resources across a wider area, increase the repair costs, complicate logistics, disrupt transportation, force infrastructure operators to spend money on protection instead of expansion, and gradually increase economic pressure behind the front lines. The wider economic implications are significant. Russia is already dealing with rising military expenditure, labour shortages remain severe, inflation continues to be a challenge, interest rates remain at highly elevated levels, sanctions are still restricting access to some technologies and equipment, and now one of the most important sectors in the Russian economy is facing increasing operational difficulties. If oil production remains below target levels, export revenues could come under pressure. If refining capacity remains constrained, fuel prices will rise. If fuel prices rise, inflationary pressures increase. And if inflation remains elevated, the central bank has less room to cut interest rates. The consequences begin to spread throughout the wider economy. The timing is also problematic for Russia. Russia is moving into one of the busiest periods of the agricultural calendar. Farmers require huge quantities of diesel fuel. Harvesting equipment requires fuel. Transporting crops requires fuel. Agriculture remains one of Russia's most important industries, so any disruption to diesel supplies can therefore affect far more than just motorists. It will affect food production, transport costs, supply chains, and ultimately consumer prices. There's also an important military dimension to this story. Modern warfare consumes enormous quantities of fuel. Tanks require fuel, so do armoured vehicles, military trucks, aircraft, generators. Everything depends on some form of energy. And the Russian military continues to receive priority access to supplies. But every litre allocated to military operations in Ukraine is a litre that can't be used elsewhere in the economy. And as the war continues, balancing those competing demands becomes increasingly difficult. Perhaps the most interesting development, however, is the reaction from ordinary Russians here. Social media channels have increasingly featured photographs of queues at gas stations, reports of shortages, and complaints about availability. Now, it's important to note that Russia is not facing a nationwide fuel crisis. This is regional. But I think the point here is visibility. For more than 4 years, the Kremlin has worked hard to shield ordinary Russians from direct consequences of the war. Fuel shortages that made tasks much harder. People notice queues. People notice rising prices. People notice empty pumps. And people notice when they can't buy diesel for their business or put gasoline in their car. And once those conversations start happening on social media, the war begins to feel much closer to home. And that, I think, is the important takeaway from today's video. The significance is not simply that Russian oil production has fallen, which it has. The significance is not just that some regions are experiencing fuel shortages. The significance is that Ukraine's drone campaign appears to be creating economic consequences that are becoming increasingly difficult for Russia to hide. For the first 4 years of this conflict, many Russians wouldn't even have noticed that the war was going on. It wasn't affecting them. However, that distinction is now changing because Russia built its economic strength around energy and geopolitical influence relating to that energy. And now energy infrastructure itself in Russia is becoming one of the most important battlegrounds for the war. And if the current trend continues, lower production, refinery disruption, logistical bottlenecks, and growing shortages could create increasing pressure on both the Russian economy, the Russian government, and the Russian people. And that may prove ultimately to be one of the most significant developments in the conflict over the next few months. So I'll keep you posted on any future news and developments, but hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much for that support. I really do appreciate it. It helps to keep me focused and making as many videos as I can. Just want to mention that Joe Blogs Russia is now live. If you're just interested in my Russian content, then that's the place for you. Go and subscribe to that channel and watch some of the videos, please. Joe and Naz is also live. Just wanted to mention it because it's a bit of fun. It will put a smile on your face, so please go and subscribe to that channel as well.